Thank you very much, Mr. Brower. Reverend Stanton, President Windsor, members of the faculty, administration, most of all, again, graduates and families that have seen you through these days and years of blood, sweat, and tears, and friends of Christopher Newport. I've been asked to speak on integrity in government this afternoon, and I would like to do it from the standpoint of our history and national purpose. This is our bicentennial year, and hopefully we can see that it is only on a foundation of integrity that an individual, an institution, a nation, or a people can hope to fulfill themselves. Let's go back to the very beginnings. The last day of the Constitutional Convention, September 17th. It's been a long, hot summer. The disputes had been many and ardent. And finally, there lay before the convention the enrolled Constitution. It was read, and the first statement following it was to be by Dr. Benjamin Franklin. It was a time of respect. He was not only the eldest, but agreed the wisest. But the difficulties of the long summer had made it too heavy a burden, fortunately. So he wrote out his remarks, and we have them not just through the inadequate shorthand of a James Madison, a Yeats, or a Hamilton with his sketchy notes. We have them from the man himself. It's probably fair to say that no one was sure precisely what would be said for Benjamin Franklin by James Wilson of the Pennsylvania delegation when he began reading. Almost immediately these words were heard: "I accept this Constitution with all its faults, if such they be." And some have reported that a ripple of relief went through the hall. Those there remembered the moment that Edmund Randolph of Virginia had said he could not be a party to a delegation of power from the people to a central government that didn't simultaneously reserve to the people the fundamental human rights that were subsequently incorporated in our Bill of Rights. For that and a number of other reasons, he left the hall. And Benjamin Franklin, some say, half rose as if to follow, but sat back down. Then Franklin ended on what is at once both the most challenging and perhaps pessimistic note of our early years anyway. He said, "This republic too shall certainly," that's not poor Richard's usual word. As a wise man, he was skeptical, but he knew so much history, shall certainly end in despotism, when the people have become so corrupted as to be incapable of any other form of government. That's both an interesting and an instructive formulation. The republic will end when the people have become so corrupted. He didn't say when some foreign and alien and evil force invades our shores. He didn't say when some power-hungry tyrant seizes all the reins of government, overthrows the will of the people. He didn't say when Her Majesty the mob, lawless and violent, tears established order asunder. He said when the people have become so corrupted as to be incapable of any other form of government. G.K. Chesterton once noticed, in between writing what are generally insipid letters to his son, that at least as of the time at which he commented, one nation in history was founded on principle. And that was the United States of America. All others on force, on fear, on greed, and one on principle, and the principle he called freedom. If we look through our history, I think perhaps we can find some important truth there. But first, to flash back to 17 that is, we can hear the redoubtable Abigail writing Good John Adams. This country has too many high-sounding words and too few actions that correspond to them. She was upset by rhetoric, which subsequently encapsulated in phrases like, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, is to be purchased at the price of change and slavery, forbid it, Almighty God," by a great man from this state who owned slaves. Perhaps Nat Turner could hear the reverberations of the words later on. Then a phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." That really got the best of Abigail. And Good John warned her, "Never doubt, dear Abigail, that we shall never relinquish our prerogatives." A young Lincoln, 29, in the late 30s, could feel strongly the same thing that Benjamin Franklin was talking about. In his Young Men's Lyceum speech, shortly after the murder of Elijah Lovejoy and the destruction of his presses in southern Illinois, Lincoln, who was ever after seemingly affected by that, observed first that no Bonaparte, misspelled, but you can still remember the name in those days, with all of his military hordes, could ever set a footprint on the Appalachian or sip water from the Ohio. Of course, if they tried that now, that'd be the end of that particular invasion. If they didn't die on the spot, they'd have hepatitis so bad that we'd have to help them get back home, wherever they came from. Let's hope that's not our ultimate weapon. He went on to urge that we make law the political religion of the nation. Preach it to the lisping babe from the pulpits and throughout the land. A just law, a social compact, a consensus arrived at by reason, through experience. Thoreau, in what I consider his greatest essay among some awfully hard choices, Life Without Principle, observed that America, we are told, is to be the arena in which the battle for freedom is fought. How sad that even a Thoreau has to be caught up in the limits of our language that speaks so constantly in battles and fought and arena. But there it is. He went on to say, but surely this can't mean mere political freedom. For what have a people accomplished who have liberated themselves from a political despot and live in economic slavery? What has America accomplished to have ridded itself of George III and live under King prejudice? What is the purpose of political freedom but a means to an end? Moral freedom. And we moved on. In our time, we've seen the most serious challenges to national integrity. We want desperately somehow or other to think that it's a matter of integrity in government. If only those bad people there would be good, the rest of us, in all of our goodness, could live happily ever after. We forget the wisdom of one of our great philosophers, Walt Kelly, who tried to tell us through his character Pogo, we have met the enemy, and they is us, which was his way of saying there is no enemy, there's only us. The idea that somehow or other the character of people in government or in business or in the ghettos and slums of America or in our religious institutions or our educational institutions are significantly and dramatically different from the moral values of the people as a whole is false. The basic problems are, as has been so often told, most people are as unaware of their value patterns today as they are the air they breathe. W.H. Auden described his great surprise when he decided to write a poem about the unknown American citizen. He had two things he was trying to do. First, he loved this country, and he wanted to say something about our character. And second, he was a little put out that there were so many monuments to unknown soldiers and so few to unknown citizens because there are so many more of the latter than of the former, and no one ever seemed to appreciate them. So he wrote it, to our regret. And among the lines most relevant, I think, to this subject are these. Both producers research and high-grade living declare he was fully sensitive to the advantages of the installment plan and had everything necessary to the modern man. A radio, a phonograph, a car, and a Frigidaire. Our researchers of public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of year. When there was peace, he was for peace. And when there was war, he went.
Obviously, what Auden is saying is we're a very materialistic people. That all that's necessary to modern man is a radio, a phonograph, a car, and a Frigidaire. A little dated, but it's just the type of gadget now. It differs perhaps. And finally, and more importantly, that too often as individuals we don't stand for anything. We hold the proper opinions for the time of year. Now let's try to think about all that we saw in Watergate, all that we've seen in the disclosures about the CIA and the FBI, and ask ourselves whether they reflect some of these things we've been talking about. Why is it that we have to debate whether we should permit American corporations to bribe foreign nationals? Don't we know right from wrong? Is what's happening here what happened to the Spain that Ortega Gasset lamented when in conclusion in his great book, The Revolt of the Masses, and probably thinking of little Guernica and wondering how it is that man could have created a machine and named it Stuka and caused it to sail out of a clear Spanish sun and just kill hundreds of people, concluded that Western Europe had lost its moral code. So what Reinhold Niebuhr was thinking about when sitting up over the Hudson at Union Theological Seminary, he said, I see America coming apart because it has lost consensus. What a nice word for a theologian. Consensus. Feeling together. No feeling together. Carl Menninger hardly missed it, a man of science, a man who's told us so many things we need to know, titling his last book, this eminent and learned man of science, Whatever Became of Sin. Sid and Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, talking about sinners in the hands of an angry God. It's a man of medicine, of science, of psychiatry saying we know right from wrong, but we have become so soft on it that we don't do what's right. And then somehow or other we expect people in government to act by a different code than we do. I can't tell you that I find a significantly different moral code among all those young lawyers that hung around the White House during the Nixon years than among their peers outside. I wish I could. It'd be so much simpler. But finally, these matters reflect the character of the nation as a whole. Think of this, that after all the anguish, all the hearings, all the testimony, the summer of '74, watching the bobbing eyebrows, and if you couldn't see it during the day, you watched it on late television, one disclosure after another that tormented us about what people in government had been doing with our money, with our rights, with our future. All the work that followed, I testified, as did hundreds of others, for hours and hours, worked on drafting bills, 18 to 20 legislative proposals that clearly could do whatever systems of law can do to prevent a recurrence of Watergate. Not a single bill enacted into law since Watergate designed to prevent its recurrence. And you and I anguished over that, or generally oblivious. But even more ominous, and what an incredible paradox. While for all that we suffered through the exposures of Watergate, and perhaps we'll go through the same thing after the conclusion of the work on the CIA and the FBI, no reform legislation. There was coming up all this while the first federal criminal justice code. Let me tell you something. A criminal justice code tells you a whole lot about the values of the people, because it has to make hard choices. We've never had a criminal justice code at the federal level. We've had a scatteration of laws passed through fear and prejudice and need through the years, laying there irrelevant and harmful, some absolutely necessary, but they probably the fewer parts. And suddenly we find what can barely see on the scene in the Congress of the United States, a Senate Bill 1, 753 pages, a complete federal criminal justice code reflecting values of violence, of reliance on segregation, the authorization of deception in government, and absolute obedience to authority as its underlying principle. Too many illustrations to get into. The use of violence at a time that we desperately need to revere life would reinstate the death penalty. 9 crimes for which this society and all its generosity and justice and power and affluence would kill people in its grasp. It would authorize police to use deadly force not under that only circumstance that I have ever been able to see it justifiable, to save life. You can take care of the rest later, but use deadly force, that is a gun or something, shooting a 12-year-old kid who's running away from you in the back. You cannot do that except to save life, the life of an officer, the life of another person. Yet S1 would authorize the use of deadly force and violence in a range of areas, including such things as to prevent a fleeing felon from escaping. Observing on this in Illinois a few weeks ago, someone said, you know, it's a felony to pass a check in an amount greater than $10. You have insufficient funds in the bank. Somebody could have just written that check and be walking out the bank, and that would be legal justification for the use of deadly force. Segregation is a problem solver. We've tried again and again, in spite of our commitment to freedom, as we call it. Look at the original Americans, those who were at the dock to meet John Smith, the Mayflower and the rest. The Indians, segregated into reservations that have made them the most deprived of all of our people. Suddenly you have a criminal justice code that would come up with a great lengthening of imprisonment sentences at a time when all of our intelligence and all of our experience tells us that the prison as an institution has failed, that it has increased our capacity for antisocial conduct, that it is probably the most effective educational institution in our society, but it teaches the wrong lesson, violence, and has manufactured crime. Suddenly you would have the authorization to use techniques of entrapment, deceiving people to cause them to commit crime so they can be arrested. After all we've been through, don't we know better than that? Don't we understand what you do to society when you take a person like Boyd Douglas and put him in a prison with Father Philip Berrigan? And suddenly he says to Father Philip Berrigan, who he has come up to, this FBI informer and agent provocateur, this man that the FBI itself called in its confidential memo subsequently revealed an experienced and effective, confident man. Yes, Father Phil, I was an altar boy. And by the way, I was in the Army, and I learned about explosives. I'd like to get some primer for it for you. I'd like to show you how to use explosives. No, Boyd, I don't care about explosives. What about a gun? Don't you need a gun? I know where I can get a gun. Don't you want a gun? No, Boyd, I don't want a gun. And then we read about FBI agents firing guns at federal buildings in San Diego, trying to induce someone else to do the same. We hear about a paid FBI agent provocateur leading people into a Camden, New Jersey draft court. And here we are, the people of the United States, through S1, putting our imprimatur on that sort of conduct. let me talk about our commitments: freedom to equality, to democracy. Let's look at education and equality for a moment. Tomorrow it will have been 22 years since one of the most important blows for liberty ever struck in this land resounded. Ramsey Board of Education, opening up for all of our people a chance to know the truth and to be set free. Somehow or other we had finally learned what Frederick Douglass was trying to tell us in chapter 7 of his great autobiography. He had worked in the fields on the eastern shore of Maryland, right up the peninsula here, as a slave. He was a bright and attractive youngster, and the Ault family decided to take him into the home in Baltimore, where he could take care of their youngest child, Tommy. Mrs. Ault was a very religious woman, and every day she would read the Bible to Tommy. Frederick Douglass was very bright, very inquisitive, and he listened. And soon he would sit beside her, and she followed under the words with her finger as she read. And Frederick Douglass learned to read. It was a crime in Maryland then, as it was a crime in Virginia then, as it was a crime in Texas, from where I come then, for reasons that I assume are obvious. One evening, Tommy and Frederick Douglass and Mrs. Ault were sitting there, and Frederick Douglass was now reading from the Bible, and Mr. Ault walked in and saw this slave reading and flew into a rage and sent Frederick Douglass immediately back to the plantation. And from this we learned a number of things. First, Douglass said life was never quite the same. Sure, some of the joy was taken out of it, but from then on, his future was determined. Soon he was trying to teach other slaves how to read. He was caught in the basement of a church, brutally beaten at age 16, and that's when he ran away. He grew to become the great man, the free man, the enormous force that he was and remains in our society. The Ault family was never the same. We're told in a note that she wrote many years later that the relationship in the family was just never the same after that moment. And though Frederick Douglass believed that she loved him always, she wrote many years later, "But how perfectly stupid it was of me to have ever permitted a slave to learn to read. Why couldn't I have seen that cannot be? Because the power that comes with that capacity to read and the knowledge that flows from it is absolutely incompatible with the condition of servitude." Yesterday in the New York Times, and hopefully in your papers too, there was a story. It said that the Attorney General of the United States, Edward H. Levy, a very old friend of mine, he was a professor at the University of Chicago, and I studied him. As chance would have it, he was the first person to inform my wife and I that my father had been appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. We just left class and gotten back to our little apartment on a fourth floor walk-up in 5700 block of South Blackstone. And we were fixing lunch, and we could hear somebody thundering up the stairs, and it was Professor Levy, and he said, "Have you heard the news?" And we hadn't, because we'd been out all morning. He'd gone home and turned on his radio, and my father'd been appointed to the Supreme Court. This news story said that the Attorney General of the United States is considering whether to file a brief amicus curiae in the United States Supreme Court, which he has to do tomorrow, the 22nd anniversary of Brown v. Board. 22 happens to be the median age of college graduates this year, seeking to reverse the Boston school desegregation case.